Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie with another one of our YouTube lessons, which are descendants from the Sunday school class at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. We're still doing this remotely because of the pandemic. We're now back to, we finished the Gospel of Mark. We're going to do the first 7 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. And all the Gospels are somewhat different, that they actually preserved more diversity in the New Testament when they picked these 4 Gospels. There are many other Gospels that didn't make it as the 4 Gospels. And Matthew's different, significantly different than Mark, somewhat different than Luke, very different than John. The author is unknown. There's no name on it. It didn't say, I, Matthew, wrote this. The name for it really came from one of the obscure apostles. The 4 of them are well known. Simon Peter and his brother Andrew and James and John. There's a few others, but they had a Matthew was one of the apostles, and that's why they attached the name to this gospel. There's really no name on it. So we have no idea who the author was. You can say certain things about the author from the nature of the text. It's written in very elegant Greek, so it's clearly a person who knew Greek well, maybe as part of the Jewish diaspora like Paul was, who used Greek as their original language. He doesn't really make the Aramaic references that Mark does. He clearly is the most Jewish of the 4 gospel writers, even though 3 of them appear to have been Jewish, authors of Matthew, Mark, and John. Luke clearly was a Gentile. But it's the most Jewish of the gospels in that it stakes out a position which it goes all the way through that Jesus came as the fulfillment of the law, the kind of the culmination of the relationship between God and the Hebrews that came about from the patriarchs and Moses up till Jesus' time. But what's the most most specifically Jewish that Jesus came as the fulfillment of the law. Now this seems to somewhat contradict Paul's message, because Paul said that Jesus came to replace the law, not to affirm it. I think they're talking about 2 different things. What Paul was talking about is the application of the law in a series of very specific rules for human action that didn't make any sense to Paul. Why do you have to have circumcision? Why can you not eat shellfish? Why can you not eat other types of things? That the rules seem to have become too powerful in the Judaism of his time. They got in the way of your relationship to God. In Matthew's application, he's talking about a much more generic, the law as an overall entity of your relationship to God. You're trying to fit yourself into the God's divine plan. So I don't see them in that much of a contradiction. You can make an argument there, but I really don't see one there. But it's very Jewish. He will go through a number of quotes of very great detail of the Jewish literature showing how Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And like I said, these are very extensive quotes from the Old Testament. And it puts it in a particular context that we need to understand and deal with and be comfortable with it. So he is the fulfillment of the law, the fulfillment of God's relationship with the Hebrew people, going back to Abraham and to Moses. He begins with a totally different birth narrative. And remember that the more prized one comes just from Luke. The angels and the shepherds, the Annunciation and the manger. That's in Luke. Now, John has no birth narrative. Mark has no birth narrative. Matthew has a completely different birth narrative. Matthew has the Magi, the wise men, coming from the east. We don't know where they came from. They came from the east. We don't know who they were. They don't say 3. They had 3 presents, so gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but we didn't say 3, didn't say 5, doesn't name them. Fictional names have been attached to them, but they're just the Magi from the east. People presume they came by camel. That's the logical way, but we don't know that. And they certainly arrived much later than when Jesus was born that night and laid in the manger. When they see the star in the east, and they come from the east, and they go to Herod, and they ask King Herod, where is the king of the Jews going to be born? So we've come to pay him homage. Well, this didn't sit well with Herod. If you know much about Herod, he's called Herod the Great. This is Herod the Great, the original king, who was a great ruler in that he built he built the second temple and he built a lot of palaces. He was a mean, nasty, ruthless, evil man. He killed several of his sons. He killed a couple of his wives. He killed a mother-in-law. And so he was a really nasty guy. They asked Herod. Herod doesn't know where the Messiah is supposed to be born. So he consults his scribes and scholars, and they quote Micah, and it's Micah chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, which is the Magi will come from the line of David, the seed of Jesse. So he'll be born in Bethlehem, which was the town of David's family. And that's only about 5 to 6 miles southeast from Jerusalem. So Herod sends them off to find the child, and he says that when you find him, come back and tell me, and I'll come and do him homage. Well, after they find the child, and by this time they're living in a house, they're not in the manger anymore, and they describe it as the child bore. It sounds more like he was a year or two. They present their gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Frankincense and myrrh are heavy oil perfumes from particular trees in the Arabian area, and these are gifts of homage and honor. Then they turn and head off back to the east to get away from Herod. Now, the scripture has them having a dream to be warned not to go back to Herod. I don't think they needed a dream. Whether they had a dream or not, I don't know. They didn't need a dream to know what a scumball Herod was. I'm certain the three of them walked out of there after meeting him, and as soon as they get out of earshot, they say, "What a slimeball this guy is. We're not going to come back and tell him where this child is, because he'll come and kill it." I mean, they've certainly figured it out right away. So Herod's furious with them, and sends his soldiers down, and they slaughter all the males under age 2 in the Bethlehem area. Now, prior to that, I got out of line here. Matthew does trace Jesus' lineage from Adam and Eve down through Abraham, down through David, down to Joseph. Now, Joseph isn't actually Jesus' father. Joseph's kind of a stepfather, but that's the lineage he has. In Luke, it goes down through Mary. And being a believer in the Nicene Creed that Jesus is fully man and fully human with the mystical union of the two, just want to make a little bit of a point about Jesus' human heritage. That Mary, his mother, was a Western Semitic person by ancestry. So Jesus would have been brown-skinned, black-haired, and dark-eyed. And this is in contrast to the picture we usually see of him with fair skin and light hair and blue eyes. I don't know what he looked like, but he didn't look like that. So it's a very interesting point to make in this time of ethnic tension in our nation, that back in the 60s, when I was in youth group in Presbyterian Church in West Virginia, there was tremendous racial tension in the town. In Huntington, there still might be now, I don't really know. It's not a racially benign state historically. And I remember one argument, this guy shouted, "Well, it was no accident that Jesus was a white Caucasian." And I said, he was not. Nobody wanted to listen to me. I was the bookworm nerd of the class, and still am. And so it's an important thing to remember that Jesus' ancestry was Western Semitic. So he would have looked like a Western Semitic person, not like the white people that we tend to portray him now at this point. So that's a good thing to file away if that argument ever comes up, because I know there's a lot of ethnic tension right now in our society, unfortunately. And then Herod's going out to kill them, and Joseph is warned in a dream to take his family and flee into Egypt, which he does. And they flee into Egypt down across Sinai. We don't know where they went in Egypt, how they stayed there, how long they stayed there. Herod dies in 4 BC. There's been a lot of debate around what the Star of Bethlehem was, and nobody really knows. Certain of the planets came together. I think it was Saturn and Jupiter and Venus came together about 6 BC, and they would have stayed together for a while. You know, the planets have different orbits. They wander in the ancient sky as opposed to the stars, which are always fixed. And some people thought that was the Star of Bethlehem. The Magi could have been astrologers from the east. That's possible. And that would place it about 6 BC because Herod died in 4. There was a prominent comet noted in the Chinese and Korean literature about 5 BC that probably would have been visible in the Palestine area. Also, comets were signs of divine intervention, or cosmic events is a better way to phrase it. Could have been that. I've always wondered if it was a supernova, an exploding star, which would burn bright for days or weeks even, until it eventually, even months, until it eventually, maybe, I don't know, an astronomer can call me and send me a message, tell me how long supernovae last. Could be maybe a couple of years. And then it collapses and becomes a black hole. So it could be any of those things. I don't really know. But that does time it to where it's probably before Herod's death in 4 BC. So that would put Jesus' birth around 6 or 5 in BC. And then they fled in to Egypt. And then they came back when Herod died, and they chose to settle not in the Bethlehem area, which was ruled by one of Herod's sons, Archelaus, but up into the Galilee area, which was ruled by a different son, Herod Antipas. Now, Archelaus was so incompetent that as a ruler that the Romans deposed him in 6 BC and placed him with Roman people, of which Pilate was the last one we're dealing with 30 or so years later. What does this make Jesus' family? Jesus' family were refugees. They were refugees going into Egypt to get away from Herod. They were refugees coming back. The Roman Catholic Church has a very strong pro-refugee position. They always value refugees and protect them, shelter them, etc. This is a controversial point now also, but if you got strong opinions about this, just remember that Jesus and his family were refugees. And this is why the Catholic Church has a very strong position. Other churches have strong positions. Also, the public, it's a controversial thing now, but just remember, if you're going to condemn refugees, you're going to condemn the Lord and his family. And then it goes to, they've returned after Herod's died. They're living in the Nazareth area up in the Galilee. And then it goes forwards a number of decades to the proclamation of John the Baptist. John the Baptist, of course, was the fulfillment of the prophecy that Elijah in some form would return to proclaim the return of the Messiah, the arrival of the Messiah. And he's baptizing people in the Jordan River, and Jesus comes to be baptized. This is a little bit challenging to John because John thinks, hey, I shouldn't be baptizing you. You should be baptizing me. But Jesus says, no, don't worry about it. And so they do the baptism. They have the same scene out of Mark of the heaven opening and the dove descending and the voice. Then they have an odd section to me where he's tempted by something that has two different names. First, it's called the tempter. Then it's called the devil, the second and third time. And he's offered dominion of the world and throw yourself down off the temple and the angels will rescue and make the stones bread. And he rejects it all the time. Now, being a believer in the total divinity of Jesus, why would this be a temptation? Jesus was in charge of all this anyway. So it's never made a lot of sense to me around that theology. I think the point of it is, and again, write me an email if you want to critique me, because these are opinions, not facts, that the point of it is they're trying to show the reading audience that Jesus was above temptations by values of the world, that his values were spiritual, his values were of the next world, and he was above that temptation. That's my own opinion, but I've never really completely understood the point of it here in the temptation. And then he starts his ministry in Galilee. He preaches in the synagogues. Now remember, the synagogue was the local meeting house kind of for the Pharisaic Judaism, that the official worship place was the one temple for the one God in Jerusalem. A lot of people couldn't go there every week, of course. If you've been as far north as Galilee, you couldn't walk down and back. And so they developed, the Pharisees did after the return from exile, the synagogue movement, which was a local church, community hall, meeting house, served a variety of things. And they would congregate on the Sabbath, and they would read from the scriptures and have lessons, and that's what Jesus was teaching. that he begins to teach there, and he decides to call his first four apostles, Simon, who became Peter, and his brother Andrew, and they were fishermen, and James and John, who were the sons of Zebedee, and they were fishermen also. Clearly, their families owned the boats, because if you study the history of Peter through the Gospels, he goes back periodically to being a fisherman, so I'm certain his father owned the boat, and he could come back and fish for a while to restore himself or whatever. So these were the families of the fishing boat owning group in the Sea of Galilee along the north shore, because Peter's house is in Capernaum, which is in the northwest point of the Sea of Galilee. And then Matthew goes next to the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount finishes all of chapter 5, 6, and 7. We're familiar with the Beatitudes, which are the first part of chapter 5, but the rest of it continues the Sermon on the Mount. And there's a couple points I'd like to make about this. There's 5 sections of the Sermon on the Mount. One is chapter 5, 3 through 28, and this is when gives us to maintain the divine, to show the spirit in which we should live. It includes the Beatitudes, which are the blessing for the poor and the meek and the suffering and all that. The second is chapter 6, 1 through 18, the way to live to fulfill the law, how we're supposed to act toward each other, to act toward God. The third is chapter 6, 19 to 34, which is detachment from the wealth. This is a particular issue all through the 4 Gospels, that you can't love God and money. It says it much more clearly than those terms, but you have to be detached from the wealth. You can't serve 2 masters. You can only serve one master, either God or money. Then the 4th section, which is chapter 7, 1 through 12, attitudes toward our neighbors. Love our neighbor, turn the other cheek. These are really challenging things to do. And then the 5th section is the end of chapter 7, 13 through 22. Entering into the kingdom is through the straight and narrow gate. It's hard to get in. It's easy to drift away. And these are the 5 general themes that we see. Now, it's interesting that Matthew has Jesus go up on a mountain to do this, because if you're familiar with the Hebrew encounters with God, they happen on mountains. Moses on Mount Sinai, Elijah on Mount Horeb. So he puts them on the mountain. When Luke does this, in his version, he puts it on the Sermon on the Plain. So where he did it, which mountain or what planet, we don't really know. I would suspect that Matthew took a lot of his teachings on other things and put them into the chapter 6 and chapter 7. He may not have said all of this at one time, but he compiled them there so that we can get them in a comprehensive thing. Now, the Beatitudes are various blessings for the poor in spirit, blessings for the gentle, blessings for the mourners, that they will be relieved, blessing for those who hunger for righteousness, because that's a tough thing to hunger for, not for wealth, not for power, but for righteousness. Blessings on the merciful. It's easy to be critical, it's hard to be merciful. Blessings for the pure in heart. None of us are really completely pure in heart, but we should strive for purity in the heart. Blessed for the peacemakers. That's a tough thing too. Being a peacemaker, you have to have great courage to try to make peace. It's easy to hide in animosity and hostility, but it takes great courage to be a peacemaker. Then he begins to reference other analogies. One is the salt of the earth, that the salt loses its taste, then it's worthless, and you can just throw it out and walk on it. It's interesting how that has become one of the terms to describe somebody as a good, solid person, as the salt of the earth. Comes right out of the scripture. And we talked about the light to the world. If you light a lamp, you don't put it underneath something where you can't see. You put it on the table where it can be the light to the world. That's the term we've used a lot in other situations also. And how to be the fulfillment of the law. Then he gets into some behavioral things, that anger is as bad as violence. It's a very interesting argument. It's just as bad to hate your neighbor as it is to do violence against your neighbor. That's quite a challenge, because any of us are I'm trained to not do violence. That's not my style. But whether I can avoid anger with people and hatred, that's easier said than done. But that's Jesus very clear, that anger is as bad as violence. We give some advice. If you're in a controversy with your brother and you're going to go to court and have this fight, settle it first beforehand. Now that's actually a common legal strategy now. But he's saying basically resolve these things. Most of these things aren't worth fighting about anyway. Lust is as bad as adultery. Now, I'm certain each of us has been guilty of that one. And I reminisce back in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was running for the president for the first time against Gerald Ford. He admitted in an interview that he had committed adultery in his heart many times, and people made fun of him about it. I thought, this is a politician who's being really honest about what it's like to be a human being, because we all have these feelings. I thought people should have praised him instead of made fun of him, but he was above everybody theologically in that point, that people would make fun of him. Then he has some very specific things. Again, as we talked about in Mark, divorce is not allowed, even though the Hebrew law allowed it. Jesus doesn't. And I always think that that's to protect the women, because the women get thrown out by their husbands who keep all the property. There's no way they can make a living as a single, divorced 40-year-old female other than being a prostitute. So, I think there's a great importance in that. How important it is now, it's tricky. And we won't go on to that one again. No, and then he said there's no eye for an eye. He condemns revenge, period. Now, let's go back to an eye for a minute. If you look in the Old Testament, people use that to justify revenge, and that's not what it says in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament, what it's doing is it's restricting what you can do. That if someone causes you to lose your eye, you can't kill them in response, which is what you would do in a blood feud. You would say it's really a restriction, only an eye for an eye, only a limb for a limb. So it's actually a restriction on revenge, even though people misquote it and use it to justify revenge. And he said, not even that. If they strike you on one cheek, offer them the other cheek instead. To turn the cheek, to turn away violence. Love your enemies. Pray for those who hate you. That's an easy one to say. Loving your enemies is very, very difficult. Pray for your persecutors. I had a difficult time career-wise at Ohio State, and I had a National Baptist pastor who was a friend and a patient, and I had switched departments under great duress, and he asked me, was I praying for the people who would run me out of family medicine? And I said, no. He said, you have to. So I started, and suddenly all the animosity I felt floated away as I prayed for them. So most of the people that are doing you evil are really unhappy, unfortunate, maybe powerful, but miserable, pathetic people. So you need to be praying for them, and if you do, you forgive them and you forgive yourself, and you move beyond that. So it's very, very important. Talked about not showing off and giving your money or praying in public to gather praise on yourself. He talked about, and this goes on all the time in churches. And all the time in life, people give big donations, but they want the building named for them or this or that or the other. He's saying, no, don't do that. Then he had the detail of the Lord's Prayer. We draw it directly from Matthew. And there is a bit that is not in the text, and thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. That's added liturgically later as Christianity evolved. It's actually not in Matthew. Some churches stop before that. Other Methodist Church has included it. It's added later. I don't think it makes any difference that it was added later. Do not store up earthly treasures, and they can be lost. Thieves can steal them, they can rust, they can mold. Store up heavenly treasures, because these will last when earthly treasures don't. And he gets very specific. You can't love God and money. You can't serve two masters. This is really tough, because it's easy to get in that trap. You cannot love two different masters. You either love one and hate the other, or you hate one and love the other. Try not to worry. God will provide. God will provide. Providence will provide for you. Other ones, which is very interesting and challenging, is do not judge others, lest you be judged yourself. I felt judged being a different person all along, many times, even in church, judged by the other people because I wasn't one of the cool crowd or the in crowd. Don't do that, he said. And he makes the analogy of how can you worry about the speck in your rival's eye when you don't see the plank in your own eye. So, don't be critical of others because you've got some things to be about which they can be critical of you. He talked about the effectiveness of prayer, ask and it shall be given, seek and ye shall find, emphasizes the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a really good way to remember it, how you're going to love your neighbor. If you're going to do this, do people really want, did you want them to do this to you? Again, he talks about entering the narrow gate. That's tough. It's easy to drift away and go this way and that way. An interesting statement, be wary of false prophets. And I had read that, and I thought, boy, is that an interesting thing in our time. Think of all the false prophets we've seen, people making fortunes off of television ministry and stuff like that. You've had some famous ones, Jim Bakker, he and his wife Tammy Faye, and they had the PTL Club and all this, and he gets sent to prison on embezzlement charges, and he comes out and he's back on TV preaching again, and now he's selling hokum things. So be careful of these people. Some of these people have great skill as a salesperson, and they figured out they can sell themselves as evangelists, and people will send them gobs of money, and they can make a lot of money. But these are truly false prophets. Jimmy Swaggart was that, or he had all his sexual misbehaviors. We had a local one around here whom I won't name. You got to beware of these people. Be very careful that people who are skilled with sales can figure out they can use this to prey on the vulnerable people, send them money, and they live like princes. So it's very disturbing to me. Be on guard against the false prophets. We've had them all along ever since Jesus' time. We have them now. They're still going to be out there. Then the final wrap up is to build your house on a solid foundation, on a stone foundation. If you build your house on a sand foundation, when the storms come, it'll wash you away. If you built your house properly on Jesus' words, on the stone foundation, it can survive the biggest of the storms. So that wraps up the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot. I covered a lot there because we have to do it. But remember some of those things. Don't judge people. You just turn them off and reject them. Try to welcome, even if you don't agree with them. That's okay to not agree with everybody about everything, but love them anyway. You can't love God money. Watch out for the false prophets who will try to sell themselves to you instead of these kind of words that we're talking about of not loving money and loving your neighbor and blessing everyone. Bless those who curse you. That's really interesting. This is Dr. Guthrie. We're going to stop here and we'll do another section on Matthew next week. Thank you very much.